Tom Cruise, a name that immediately brings to mind images of action-packed movies, red carpets, and endless luxury. From Top Gun to Mission Impossible, he's lived a life that most people can only dream of. We know him as one of Hollywood's biggest stars, constantly surrounded by fame, fortune, and all the comforts money can buy. But what if he stepped out of his world for a moment? What if he walked away from the glitz and glamour and faced the harsh realities of life on the streets? It's a question that Tom Cruise decided to answer, and it's not a stunt for a movie. For 1 week, he chose to live as a homeless person. No cameras, no makeup, just raw, unfiltered reality. The decision wasn't a publicity stunt or a challenge to prove a point. Tom wanted to understand something deeper: the struggles, the isolation, the fear of living without a roof over your head. This experiment would change him in ways he could never have imagined. It was more than just a week on the streets. It was an experience that would redefine everything he thought he knew about life. It wasn't an impulse. Tom Cruise didn't wake up one morning and decide to live on the streets for the thrill of it. This idea had been brewing for some time. He had seen the growing number of homeless people on the streets, heard the stories, and realized that, despite his fame, he didn't really understand their struggles. He had always lived in a world of luxury, with everything at his fingertips. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how disconnected he felt from the harsh realities faced by so many. Tom wanted to know what it was really like to live without a place to call home. He wanted to experience firsthand what it felt like to have to fight for survival every single day. His decision came from a place of genuine curiosity, but also from a deep sense of wanting to understand something he couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't about helping people or making a statement. It was about gaining a new perspective on life. He felt it was time to step out of his own bubble and challenge himself in a way that would truly open his eyes. Of course, there were risks. Tom knew it wouldn't be easy. Living on the streets meant facing danger, uncertainty, and hardship, but there was something inside him that pushed him to follow through with this. It was a personal challenge, a way to reconnect with the world beyond his fame. He felt it was the only way to really learn, to grow, and to gain the kind of insight that no movie role could ever give him. The moment Tom stepped onto the streets, he was hit with a wave of shock. No cameras, no script, just the raw, unfiltered reality of life without a home. It was nothing like he had imagined. He was used to stepping out of his car, heading into a luxurious hotel or a comfortable set, but this was different. Every corner, every sidewalk felt cold and unfamiliar. His first struggle? Finding something to eat. In his world, meals were always just a phone call away, but here, food wasn't guaranteed. The hours stretched on without a single bite. At first, Tom tried to act like it was no big deal, but soon, the hunger became impossible to ignore. It was a constant gnawing feeling in his stomach that he wasn't used to. Then there was the cold. The biting chill of the night air with no blanket or bed to retreat to was enough to freeze him in his tracks. He tried to find shelter, but it wasn't easy. Every doorway, every alleyway was either taken or unsafe. The discomfort was overwhelming. He hadn't expected to feel so vulnerable. In his career, Tom was used to being in control, directing action, being the one who made things happen. But here on the streets, he felt powerless. There was nothing he could do to escape the discomfort, the uncertainty, and the constant fear that came with being alone and invisible. He started to realize how little he knew about the world he was now part of. The people he passed by every day, the ones he'd seen but never truly noticed, were living lives filled with struggles he could barely comprehend. And yet, they had to survive. Day after day. Tom couldn't help but feel a deep sense of helplessness. It was a feeling he wasn't accustomed to, and it hit him hard. This was no longer a mere experiment. It was his new reality, and he didn't know how he was going to face it. As the days passed, Tom began to realize something unexpected. The people on the streets weren't just strangers. They weren't invisible to the world. They were human beings, each with their own story, their own struggles, and their own way of surviving. At first, Tom had kept to himself, unsure of how to interact or what to say. But slowly, he started talking to people, hearing their stories, and it changed everything. The first person he met was a woman sitting on the curb. She had a kind face, though her eyes carried the weight of years of hardship. Tom hesitated, but then sat beside her, unsure of what to say. She didn't ask him why he was there, or what his background was. She just offered a simple greeting. "You staying warm?" It was such a small question, but in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. They talked for a while, and Tom learned about her life. She wasn't just a homeless woman. She had once been a teacher, living in a comfortable home. She'd lost everything: her job, her home, even her family. She told Tom about how quickly life could change, how one event could lead to everything falling apart. Her story wasn't one of poor choices or bad luck. It was simply life. There were others too. A man named John, who had been on the streets for over a decade, showed Tom where to find food. He had a rough exterior, but his words were full of wisdom. John had learned the street codes, the unspoken rules that governed how people survived. He explained how, despite everything, there was always someone to help when it mattered most. "You look out for each other," John said, "because nobody else will." Tom started to see the kindness that existed in places he never expected. One night, after a particularly cold evening, a group of homeless people offered him their extra blankets, even though they barely had enough for themselves. They didn't ask for anything in return. They just gave because that's what they did. It made Tom stop and think. He had always associated kindness with comfort and privilege, but here on the streets, people gave without hesitation, even when they had nothing. As the days wore on, Tom's perspective shifted. He began to understand that survival on the streets wasn't just about getting by physically, it was also about holding on to your humanity. The people he met weren't just survivors, they were fighters. They had strength that he had never truly understood. Their resilience was inspiring, and Tom found himself humbled by their courage in the face of adversity. Every interaction left him with a new understanding. The homeless people he met weren't other. They weren't different from him. They were just like him. People trying to make it through another day, set, holding on to hope, even when the world around them seemed to offer nothing but despair. Each day, Tom faced a battle he'd never experienced before, just staying alive. No matter how many times he tried to remind himself that this was only for a week, the struggles began to feel endless. He had spent his life in a world of luxury, where food was always abundant and clean clothes were just a wardrobe away. But now, on the streets, every little thing had become a challenge. Finding food was the first hurdle. Tom learned quickly that meals didn't just appear. You couldn't rely on a fancy restaurant or room service. He had to search for food wherever he could find it. Sometimes it was a small piece of bread or a bag of chips left behind by someone. Other times he relied on food donations or soup kitchens. But even then, there was no guarantee. The lines were long, and sometimes they ran out before he even got a chance to eat. Water wasn't easy to come by either. He had to find public fountains or gas stations where he could sneak a drink without anyone noticing. And even when he found water, he was always cautious, worried about the quality or whether it would make him sick. It wasn't like the clean, bottled water he was used to, the kind that was always there, ready to drink. But it wasn't just about food and water. It was about finding shelter when the night came. As the temperature dropped, Tom realized just how vulnerable he was. The streets were unforgiving, especially when it rained. He would wander from place to place, searching for a safe corner or a doorway where he could huddle for warmth. There was no place to call his own, no room to escape the elements. It was exhausting. The physical toll of the constant movement, the lack of sleep, and the endless worry wore him down. The cold seeped into his bones, and he could feel his energy fading with every passing hour. His body ached, and his mind grew clouded from hunger and fatigue. Yet, in some strange way, he pushed through. There was no other option. Tom was learning that survival wasn't just about finding food and shelter. It was about constantly being on edge, constantly worrying about the next step. There were moments when he felt completely hopeless. But each day, he had to find a way to move forward, to keep going. Because when you have nothing, survival becomes a full-time job. As the days dragged on, the emotional weight of living on the streets started to settle in. Tom had expected it to be tough, but nothing could have prepared him for the mental strain that came with it. His body was exhausted, but it was his mind that was starting to crack under the pressure. The constant fear was the hardest part. Every noise, every passing shadow, felt like a threat. Tom had never experienced this kind of vulnerability before. On the streets, you never knew who to trust. The people you met could be kind one moment and dangerous the next. It wasn't like the controlled world of Hollywood, where everything had its place. Here on the streets, everything was unpredictable, and that unpredictability took its toll on his mental state. He also found himself battling loneliness in a way he had never known. Despite being surrounded by people, he often felt completely alone. There was no one to turn to for reassurance, no friends to talk to, no one to offer comfort. He missed the small things, the ability to pick up a phone and call someone, the freedom to go to a cafe and sit in peace. Instead, there was only isolation. He learned quickly that loneliness was one of the hardest things to cope with on the streets. Tom also began to reflect on his own life, his career, and what really mattered. The things he had once thought were important, his fame, his wealth, his success, started to feel hollow. Here on the streets, none of that mattered. People didn't care who you were or what you had. All that mattered was survival. The realization hit him hard. He had spent his life chasing something he thought would bring happiness, but now, surrounded by people with nothing, he saw how empty it all seemed. As the week wore on, the psychological strain grew. Tom found himself questioning everything. How had he lived in such a bubble for so long, unaware of the struggles of so many others? He thought about the homeless people he had met, how they had endured so much with little to keep them going. Their resilience, their ability to find hope in such dark circumstances, made Tom realize how much he had taken for granted. In those quiet moments, lying awake on a cold sidewalk or sitting in a shelter, Tom began to see the world through new eyes. The experience was changing him in ways he couldn't have predicted. It wasn't just about surviving for a week. It was about understanding the deep emotional toll that life on the streets could take. By the fourth day, Tom was at his breaking point. The physical and emotional exhaustion had pushed him to the edge. He had been fighting to keep going, but there were moments when he felt like he couldn't take it anymore. But then, something shifted. It wasn't an event or a dramatic moment, it was more of a quiet realization. It happened one afternoon when he was sitting with a group of homeless people outside a small convenience store. The wind was biting cold, and Tom could feel his fingers growing numb. He was hungry, tired, and starting to lose hope. But then one of the men, an older man with graying hair and a weathered face, offered Tom his last sandwich. He didn't ask for anything in return. "Take it," the man said with a quiet smile. "You need it more than I do." Tom hesitated for a moment. Here was a man who had nothing, yet he was offering his last bit of food to someone else. It hit Tom deeply. In that moment, he realized something that changed him completely. Even in the hardest of times, people on the streets found ways to be kind, to help one another, to survive together. There was a strength in them, a quiet, unshakable strength, that he had never truly understood before. Tom started to see the beauty in these small acts of compassion. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about holding on to your humanity, no matter how tough life got. People on the streets had learned how to give, even when they had nothing left. This realization gave Tom a sense of hope, something he hadn't felt in days. The experience was hard, but it was also showing him how resilient the human spirit could be. In that moment, Tom understood that strength wasn't about physical survival. It was about the ability to stay kind and compassionate, even when the world seemed to have forgotten you. As the week came to an end, Tom sat quietly in a small park, staring at the city around him. The familiar skyline, the bustling streets, everything looked the same as it always had, yet nothing felt the same. He had spent 7 days living on the streets, and those days had completely transformed his perspective. The experience had been grueling, but it had also been eye-opening. Tom had seen the raw, unfiltered truth of what it meant to live without a home. He had felt the cold, the hunger, the isolation, and the fear. But he had also witnessed something incredible. Despite the hardships, he had seen a resilience in people, an unwavering determination to survive, to hold on to hope, and to support each other. It wasn't the survival of the fittest, it was the survival of the kindest, the most compassionate. That was something Tom hadn't expected. In those moments of vulnerability, Tom had discovered a new side of himself. He had realized how much he had taken for granted in his own life. His fame, his wealth, the luxury he lived in, they all seemed so insignificant now. What mattered wasn't what you had. It was the strength to keep going when you had nothing. It was the ability to show kindness, even when you had little to give. Tom knew he would never look at the world the same way again. The streets had changed him. They had opened his eyes to a reality he had been blind to for so long. And now, as he re-entered his world of comfort and luxury, he couldn't help but carry the lessons he had learned with him. The experience had shifted his values, his priorities, and his understanding of what truly mattered.